Good morning, students. Today we'll be discussing the nature and function of a poet, or the nature of the poetic sensibility as Wordsworth has described in his preface to the Lyrical Ballads. So, the first point is the romantic conception of the poet. Wordsworth's views on the nature and function of a poet are contained in a very lengthy edition he made to the preface of 1800 for the 1802 edition of the Lyrical Ballads. These views were again stated and elaborated in his preface to the 1815 edition of the Lyrical Ballads. His views in this respect are also to be taken at least in some part as a reaction to the false and meaningless glorification of the poet in the 18th century. When we go into a detailed examination of his views, it shows that he is anxious to recall poetry to a sense of its human connections. His conception of the poet is romantic. He brings out the individualism of the poet, but at the same time, he also at every step takes care to stress his essential humanity. So, what is the social function and humanity of a poet? He says that in the very beginning, he says that he lays emphasis on his social function, that is, that of communication. First, a poet, according to him, is essentially a man speaking to men. He is a person who writes not for his own pleasure but primarily to communicate his own thoughts and emotions to his readers. He has therefore a social function to perform. So, as poets do not write for poets alone but for men, therefore they must use the language of real men and not talk in different difficult words, tricks, quaintnesses, and enigmas. He must come down from his supposed heights to the level of common man. Commenting on Wordsworth's emphasis on the common humanity of the poet, Garrett has written, quote, that the office of the poet is prophecy, that he belongs to an order of men who are rapt, possessed, uttering more than they know. Wordsworth was as well aware as other poets who have brought into greater display element of poetry which consists in ecstasy. Unquote. So it means that Wordsworth was very much conscious of the individualism of the poet, and he felt that poet was a very rare and gifted individual, a man of genius, and a person with a unique personality. So he is primarily concerned with emphasizing the connection between what is greatest in human nature and what is most lowly. In this way, he seeks or he tries to make the poet come out of his own ivory tower. In this way, he seeks to democratize the conceptions of poetry. So, what should be the chief qualifications of a poet? So, first was a man speaking to men. Second is that he should be a man who has more lively sensibility. That is to say, he reacts more strongly to external impressions, and so his emotions and passions are more powerful. He has an uncommon sensibility, and he distinguishes himself from the common run of mankind. He observes more and hears more than there is to hear and feels more than there is to feel. Means everything, his sensibility should be so lively. He has it should be an affection sensibility, and it is in this affection sensibility that poetry begins. His sensibility is affectual. It is bound up with moral nature. It is because of this affectual element in the poet's sensibility that the sense impression he receives and the passions they excite are gradually purified by the imagination, and poetry performs its true function. Next is that the poet has greater imagination. So, to write poetry, the imagination works. And so, the poet should be one who can feel or react emotionally to events and incidents which he has not directly experienced. He is affected by absent things as if they were present. And number 4, he should have a vast knowledge of human nature. And he should understand the passions which he has not himself directly experienced. He understands accurately the nature of human passions and emotions, even though he has not personally experienced those passions. Next is that he should be a comprehensive soul. A more comprehensive soul implies that the poet shares the emotional experiences of others and can identify himself emotionally with others and also express his feelings or express the feelings of others through his poetry. And he should also have a greater zest for life than an ordinary human being or an ordinary individual. He should have enthusiasm. He should rejoice in the working of life and in nature at large, and should take pleasure in communicating his own joy in life to others. So, the poet should not only have lively sensibility and more comprehensive soul, greater imagination, and also a man who has thought long and deep, but he is not one who can create a piece of art or piece of poetry at the spur of the moment, but he must have contemplated and reflect in tranquility till his passions anew, and it is then that creation begins, or it is then that a good piece of poetry starts. This process of reflection is purifying of the sensations of the poet and all that is painful and distressing, and therefore what he creates carries within joy and overbalance of pleasure. It is through this reflection or contemplation that the poet is able to combine his ideas with another, and in this way he discovers universal and general laws of our being. So, in this way he universalizes his personal experiences. Then, after some time, Wordsworth also added one more quality for the poet, that of sincerity. He says that the sincerity of the poet is seen in the care which he takes to revise and perfect his communication. He should carefully polish and refine his composition and take infinite pains to convey his meaning clearly and without any ambiguity. It is with this end in view that he should avoid all artificial and superficial language. So, what should be the language and function of a poet? The poet, he feels, should have a heightened power of communication. But even then, the language which he uses is not so lively and true as the language of men who have actually experienced those passions. The poet writes of emotions which he has himself not experienced, but which his characters have experienced, and so the passions which he communicates are mere shadows of the passions of real people. So, the language used by him should not be mechanical which is lacking in warmth. The poet should try to achieve emotional identification with the characters whose feeling he is conveying, and he should do so in a language which his characters should actually had used. This language should be modified only by one consideration, that of giving pleasure. The function of poetry is therefore is to give pleasure, and with this end in view, the poet should apply the principle of selection and purify his language of all that is coarse, painful, or disgusting. But here we see that for Wordsworth, to give pleasure didn't mean that mere idle amusement. His conception of pleasure was much higher. There is no need at all for the poet to elevate his language, because no language is nobler and more elevated than the one which is really used by men and which the poet truthfully and faithfully imitates. Then is the individualism of the poet. Wordsworth considers a poet essentially a man who is speaking to men. He has stressed the individuality of the poet. The poet writes according to his own passions and volitions. He does not write to order or on somebody's orders, means he can't write on the spur of the moment, nor does he imitate anybody. He is a law unto himself and pleased with his own violations. His own feelings are his rock of defense, his stay and support. He is not dependent on the will of anyone else. It is maybe asked if a man who has the totality of qualities laid by Wordsworth for the poet is in reality of the same flesh and blood as are. So some of us would be inclined to say that the very fact that a poet is habitually impelled to create does differentiate him in kind from ordinary flesh and blood. So in a way, what Wordsworth had written about a poet, or the qualities of a poet, make a poet a bit different from an ordinary man, because he has the sensibilities, he has the passion to write or about men in his own and feel about those emotions and passions as if they are his own. So the individuality of the poet cannot be seen over here, because he is writing on behalf or about the feelings of his characters. So his individuality will not allow him to show his own emotions. Thank you.